A very good afternoon to all. And because it is a round table and not a long table, it comes back to the host to do the wrap up. So I was given this impossible task to wrap up actually over 7 hours of conversation we've had. And even then, I feel that we've only scratched the surface of the issues that we're discussing. So I went around and I asked my colleagues, how am I going to wrap up 7 hours in 15 minutes? And one of them told me, why don't you give a story, to wrap up the day? But no story comes to mind because obviously ASEAN is not a fairy tale. Not at this point, after what we've heard from the last panel. How many of you are fans of the James Webb telescope?
Yes.
I am. Yes, me too. Beautiful images. I can spend evenings just looking at the images. It's really looking at the beginning of creation. Why do I talk about the telescope? Because how we look at ASEAN depends on the instruments that we look at ASEAN through. If you look at ASEAN through a telescope, it's beautiful. Bright constellation, dancing stars, and many stars from outside ASEAN wants to dance with ASEAN. We are, I'm told, the only show in town, And sometimes when you live in this region, you think, what kind of a show are we? Because the other instrument to look at ASEAN through is a microscope. When you look at ASEAN through a microscope, bacteria, virus, all the nasties on the petri dish of ASEAN, and you get discouraged, thinking, is this what all ASEAN is about? So, Excellencies, what I really mean to say is that this time last year, we had our 36th ASEAN Roundtable. The theme was Braving the Storms, ASEAN in Crisis. And in 2021, ASEAN really did have a lot on its plate. A raging COVID-19 pandemic crisis, deglobalization trends, high inflation, supply chain disruptions, and of course, Myanmar happened. But this year, that sense of crisis has not abated. It's in fact heightened with the sense that the international rules-based order is being rocked. Hence the question. The question is not 55 years on, is ASEAN still relevant? Question mark. It is ASEAN still relevant in a changing global order? Because we recognize that it's not business as usual. So it's no secret, this region is the theater of Sino-US rivalry, and we will see the horse trades being played out more and more in the coming years. Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan gave a compelling speech drawing parallels between the unfinished business of World War I, leading to World War II, and subsequently the colonial movements, and the current geopolitical strategic environment. So our discussions today have attempted to go deep, firstly into understanding the Great Game, starting with Kishore's 3 rules: be more self-confident, be proactive, and ASEAN should form a stronger coalition to work together. Then we moved on to Evan's 3 points. For ASEAN to stay relevant, the momentum from the AOIP should be used to move beyond reference points, to strengthen intra-ASEAN strategic environment, to tackle existing questions and challenges under the broader institutional umbrella of the ASEAN Charter. My colleague William asked the question, does the Quad undermine ASEAN? And he offered 3 scenarios, yes, no, maybe, typical academic. While the Quad is arguably using ASEAN centrality to gain entrance to ASEAN and to achieve their own goals, it does offer pragmatic deliverables on issues like climate change and vaccines. But amidst this multipolarity, ASEAN still has agency and can cherry-pick between regional strategies. So during the Q&A, we had a very good question. Can ASEAN have its cake and eat it? Ibu Dewi asked, what's the point of having a cake and not eating it? And indeed, it is true. We should have our cake and eat it. So the question is, can ASEAN exercise agency by staying in this game? In the second panel, we looked at the promises of regional economic integration, which seems somewhat diminished now when we think about the geopolitical great game being played out. But there's still hope of the region getting its act together. If not politically, then at least economically, we're there. We heard from Seah, Jay, and Alpana. And the general assessment is that ASEAN is actually doing better than other regions, but we face strong headwinds and challenges. For instance, the economic landscape promises to get worse in 2023 globally. ASEAN will also suffer from slower growth, but we will not be as badly off as the other regions. Jay gave an assessment of the short and medium-term trends that include the trade and technology war and the challenges facing the region, such as currency safety, fuel price, rise of protectionism, and anti-global sentiment. I really like what you said, Jay, about the shift from policy to values, and this is evident not only in the economic and trade circles, but really permeating through the other areas as well. For instance, when we talk about climate transition, there are also these value-based narratives going around. And Jay also highlighted the matter of resilience and self-reliance in this context. And then on to mega trends. He highlighted 4 mega trends: technological disruption, digital economy, the divergent demographics in ASEAN, and climate change challenges leading to rising inequalities. And we had a discussion on IPAF. I'm afraid, though, we have not come out that much clearer about the IPAF, except that we've come to understand that it may be a struggle to try to liberalize trade and may actually fuel bifurcation. There will be a disruption to the China-centered regional supply chains. And with that in mind, there was the point made by Jay for greater mobility and to liberalize labor across ASEAN. Alpana too, thank you. You've picked out really a sort of a bright spot for the region, where you talked about how the pandemic has been a catalyst for digitalization, and you spoke of the significance of digital economy agreements in aligning rules and standards. And that transformation in ASEAN is in progress. Unfortunately, I think we're not seeing physical manifestations of that progress, but we have to trust that it is in place. So there's room for ASEAN to work further, to leverage digitalization, create that dialogue between governments and other stakeholders to harness that potential for the benefit of businesses and consumers. And then in the third session, we tried to shine a spotlight on ASEAN's longer terms to envision its community post-2025 vision. And this vision has been tasked by the ASEAN leaders to an eminent persons group. We also looked at the potential admission of Timor-Leste. Ambassador Ong asked a good question: what is Enterprise ASEAN? And he made the point that along the way, there were problems with institutional setup, decision-making, ASEAN being reactive. But if you look back, ASEAN community has indeed brought a certain level of progress. I mean, compared to 2002, we now have the ASEAN Charter. It's out of date, he says, but what do? He sounds pessimistic that there can be no change. And he also asked the question on how do we unlock the ASEAN potential? And the point he made about ASEAN being an executive-based organization where leaders matter. But I will add that leaders matter, but leadership matters more. And that leadership is not demonstrated, as Evan talked about, by summitry or statements. And also, as Pak Marty has said, that in the coming weeks, as we see a series of summits happening in this region, we hope that ASEAN will take up that mantle of leadership and demonstrate it positively. And then we heard from Ibu Dewi, who gave a very compelling set of reasons why Timor-Leste should be admitted. And to sum it all, better in than out. Better for Timor in than to leave Timor out, because the geostrategic environment has changed. It has changed from 10 years ago, so we can no longer sit back, sit on our laurels and think everything will be hunky-dory, but it's actually more dangerous for Timor to be in. So, well, I think there are hopes that Timor will be admitted under the Indonesian chairmanship. It will be highly symbolic, and President Ramos Horta, I hope, will finally be able to surmount this and have Timor-Leste enter ASEAN. We also then talked about the empty chair threat that has been given to Myanmar. So in the second panel, we then go back to lingering questions of whether ASEAN can overcome that divide. I'm very thankful Ambassador Ving realist assessment. Yes, we recognize there is a divide. It's a fact of life. But let's not let it constrain ASEAN cooperation and unity. I think for that, Vietnam is best placed to give that assessment. There are differences, but the starting point for that divide was never maritime versus continental. So the encouragement is towards looking for commonalities amidst differences. And then Pak Marty gave us additional 2 challenges for the ASEAN Post-2025 visioning exercise, which should not be visioned only in 2025, but actually, as he said rightly, the here and now. The arc of instability that he has described, and the fact that ASEAN is really not in the best shape. And it is indeed true, because we are just coming out of 2.5 years or 3 years of the pandemic. Our governments have borrowed and given that out in stimulus measures, and we have many diverse challenges facing the region. So we're not in the best of health. And then the problem of the empty seat. So the codification of ASEAN 9 is sort of in progress. I'm not sure if it's set in stone. And to think about a formula to engage with the NUG and other parties, and for the junta to be there. But I hope that it will not become an empty chair syndrome, where we start to live with this empty chair as if it were normal, because it is not normal. ASEAN is a family of 10 and maybe becoming a family of 11. So ASEAN is an inflection point. Many of these issues discussed today will continue to be revisited in many months and years to come. 5 years ago, when Tomiko, Chang Lilin, and I did a book on ASEAN at its 50th year anniversary, we had this question on our minds. Can ASEAN last 100 years? And what would be the factors that will enable ASEAN to last that 100 years? Minister Vivian said that the question on the board here should not be a question of existential angst. And it is not. When we stop asking this question is when ASEAN is no longer relevant. So the answer perhaps lies in what all of our speakers have been saying. 1, recognize that there are differences, but also recognize that there are commonalities. 2, exercise the agency. Come on, let's eat that cake. You know, we only live once, we gotta have it. 3, can ASEAN rally around this notion of stabilizing strategic competition between the major powers? I think we can, and there is a window of opportunity that Pak Marty has outlined for us. And perhaps just to add on, the TAC is a great tool. It has been gaining in popularity in many years, in decades. Many parties want to join the TAC, and in the TAC encapsulates all of ASEAN's core and cherished principles. So colleagues, our former Thai Deputy Prime Minister, Foreign Minister Tanak Koman, whom Setan quoted, had foresaw these difficulties at the founding of ASEAN, and I quote, "In time to come, not only will ASEAN have to face the difficult task of creating and maintaining harmony among its members who have different views, different interests, and are of different stages of development, but ASEAN will also have to cope with the extremely complicated problems of dealing with hard-nosed opponents and interlocutors among the developed countries." This was said 55 years ago. How prescient were our founders? The fragile, complex, and complicated geostrategic environment presents challenges, but I would say also opportunities. If ASEAN were to stay true to its roots of preserving peace and stability, it can surely rise up to the occasion and do what needs to be done. And so with that, I want to conclude, but first, before I formally conclude, I want to express our appreciation to the moderators, Lee Su-Ann, Professor Tam, I think she has left, Joanne and Ian, for their deft moderating skills, to our dear speakers, some of whom who have traveled a long way to come here to speak with us, to our active audience here in the room and online, and to the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for their support. And may I ask for one round of applause, or many rounds of applause, for our dear admin colleagues at the back. They are always behind the scenes. They made all this possible for both the online and hybrid conferences. Please give them a round of applause. And lastly, a bit of self-promotion for the Institute. Please look out for our annual State of Southeast Asia survey, whom many speakers have already quoted in their speeches. It will be launched after the ASEAN Summit. And as you can imagine, there will be very many new questions this year, given the multitude of developments globally and regionally. So please look out for it and take the survey, because you here in the room and online, you are the voice of ASEAN, and you are our opinion leaders. So with that, I wish you all the best, and hopefully to see you next year. Thank you very much.